Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. So the individual that we're going to be speaking about today, he's a bit different, actually not really a bit, but he's very different to the kinds of figures in our past that we've spoken about in the series up until now. And the reason why I say that he's very different is because the other figures that we look at, we can see that their root and their source, their beginning is in Islam, right? They were, it's almost as if they were born and bred into the mission that they were involved in for the entirety of their life. But Malcolm X, on the other hand, he lived a very different life. He grew up in a very different situation and condition that a lot of the other leaders that we've looked at so far were born into. And he's a lot more unique in the sense that while all of these other leaders lived their life and dedicated their life to the cause of Islam for almost the entirety of their life, Malcolm X really was only a part of that mission of Islam, was only really a part of that purpose for a few months before his life was taken away from him. And so we need to give a bit of context as to the place and time that Malcolm X was born into. So he was born in 1925, and he was born in what's today is called the South. When we speak about the South in America, it's usually referring to the southern states. And the reason why they're called the South is not only geographically speaking, but also in terms of ideology. There tends to be, there used to be, and really continues to be, a lot more racism in that part of the country. And so he was born into a time where the country was experiencing segregation. And segregation is this idea that you were treated differently on a government, social, educational, personal level according to the color of your skin. So even things like public bathrooms and, you know, like the water bubblers were segregated between people who had darker complexion, right, so darker skin, and people who had lighter skin. You know, and so being as Muslims, you know, growing up in this deen, we immediately see the red flags with this way of thinking, right? But during the time that Malcolm X was born, this was considered the norm, right? It was considered just an everyday part of life to have a white section of town and what was considered a black or African American section of town. And he was brought up in a small suburb named Lansing. Now, Lansing had a history of beatings and killings and lynchings of African Americans. And they really killed them for any kind, whatever reason they could come up with. In fact, in terms of Malcolm X's own personal family, he says that of the 7 siblings, or his father had 6 siblings aside from himself. So of the 7 brothers, including his father, only one of those brothers actually died a natural death. All the other 6 actually had their lives taken from them, either from police or you know, from a crowd, an angry crowd of white people, or you know, even his father had a bit of a nasty end, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail a little later on. So when we look at Malcolm X as an individual, he speaks about his earliest memory, right? So if we all take a moment and think about what's your earliest memory in your life, right? The thing that you can go furthest back to and you can't go beyond that. His earliest memory, the thing he could go furthest back to, was something that happened in 1929, so when he was around the age of 4. And he says, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was smelling smoke, and I got up and I realized that our house was on fire. And it turned out that, and this was happening while his mother was pregnant with another one of his siblings. And so he wakes up to smoke and gunshots, because his father was actually shooting at 2 white men who were the ones who actually set the house on fire. And so this is his earliest memory, right? As a 4-year-old waking up in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke and gunshots, simply because his father had chosen to live in a suburb that was considered more of a white area. And so it kind of rubbed some of the neighbors the wrong way, right? They weren't really happy that they were sharing a street with an African-American family. And so before his father came to his end, his father was a preacher, right? So he was brought up in a Christian family. His actual birth name is Malcolm Little, and we'll get to why he became Malcolm X a little later on. So his name was Malcolm Little, and his father was a Christian preacher who was basically going around propagating the ideas of someone named, I think it was Martin Garvey, someone along those lines, a name along those lines. And basically this man's ideas were African Americans need to go back to Africa, right? Like, we need to leave this land because of the racism we're experiencing, and we need to go back there. And so his father would go around preaching the words and the ideologies of this man. And the way that he preached it, obviously he's making it sound like the white people are evil. You know, back in those days they'd call them the white devils, right? And what ended up happening is the white people that lived in that suburb, lived in that town, they weren't too happy with what his father was doing. And so on one occasion, he leaves the home, and subhanAllah, this is something that is built into Malcolm, but also his mother. Malcolm and his mother had very strong intuition, right? Intuition meaning you have this deep feeling inside of you. When you feel like something is about to happen, you have this almost shift, this change that happens inside of you, even though you have no proof of it. And he said that my mother had a much stronger intuition than I did. And on the day that my father passed away, she had one of those very strong moments. And so when his father walked out of the house, his mum, a few minutes later, had a moment of intuition, and she ran out after him. And she was trying to stop him from going into town and whatever he was going to do there. And she's yelling his name, screaming, but he was already way past down the road. And all he ever done is just turn around, waved at her, and kept walking. And so later on, what they find is that a bunch of white people, when they spotted him, the troublemaker, right? That's how they knew him as. When they spotted him, they attacked him, and they brutalized him. They broke several bones, and they left him on the tram track. And you can guess what happened after that point, right? So, and this happened before Malcolm had even turned 10. So he's fatherless at a very young age. His mother's trying to keep the house together, and it's Malcolm with about 7 or so siblings, right? So they're a large family. Now, when he starts to attend school, actually before he starts attending school, the government starts to get involved, and they try to take away Malcolm and his siblings from their mother, right? So they start to put out all of these accusations, you know, oh, she's going crazy, she's not right, she's not able to look after the kids, and they start to really harass her and hassle her. to the point that eventually she actually starts to develop mental problems and she actually starts to go crazy. And as soon as the government noticed that, they took all the children away from her and threw her into a mental institution. She never actually left that institution for the next 26 years, right? Now, when Malcolm was taken, he was given to, I guess we can say, white folks, right? So people who took him in not as foster parents, but more so as carers. So when they took him in, they put him into school, and they realized very quickly that he was actually very unique. He was actually very gifted. And he actually ended up being the only African American in the school he was attending. And he became one of the top performers in that school, to such a degree that he became the other students in his class elected him as a school captain, right? As a class captain. It's a very interesting concept considering everything else that's happening in that society, in that community, that a bunch of young white kids saw his potential, saw how good he is, and they elected him as their class captain. But Malcolm X has a few moments in his life where he really learns valuable lessons. And one of those was a time when he was speaking with one of his teachers, and it was actually one of his favorite teachers, one of the teachers he was close with. And this really gives you a sense of what the situation was like at the time. Because the words that came out of this teacher's mouth, Malcolm X himself says, "I don't think my teacher had any bad intention with what he said here. He actually said it to me out of love," right? And so what his teacher actually said to him is, he said, let me actually find the quote. He said, "Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic," right? Because he asked, the teacher asked Malcolm, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be a lawyer." So this is the teacher's response. "Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me. We all here like you," meaning everyone at the school, everyone at the town. "You know that. But you've got to be realistic about being who you are," right? Implying the colour of his skin. "A lawyer, that's no realistic goal for a black person. You need to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands, for example, making things. Everybody admires your carpentry and shop work. Why don't you do something in carpentry?" Right? So it's interesting that he's telling Malcolm, because of the colour of your skin, don't aim too high, right? You can't become a lawyer because of the colour of your skin. But the way Malcolm responds when he reflects on this moment in his life, later in his life, when he's thinking back to this, he tells himself, and he says that, you know, this teacher was actually a very nice person. He was actually very nice to me. But, and so these words, he didn't actually think of them as being bad, right? He thought, oh, you know, like he's thinking about what's best for me. But all of us can immediately see the problems in these words, right? But he was brought up at such a time where these words were actually considered good, right? It was like, for an African American, hearing these words was actually a sign that this white person cares for me. This white person actually doesn't have anything against me, right? And so Malcolm took from this a few very important lessons. And that's his nature, and that's actually something we need to develop in ourselves. No matter what happens to him in his life, he'll take a lesson from that experience, no matter how painful it is, no matter how much of a problem it is for him. He'll take a lesson from it, and he'll live that lesson for the rest of his life. So the lesson he took from this, there were two lessons he took. One of them is, he said that, he basically said, you know, look, I'm not going to apply myself, I'm not going to push myself in school anymore, because what's the point, right? I can't get to the place I want to get to. despite me having some of the highest marks in school. He says that it was a race between him and 2 other students in terms of first place, right? And he said, students who were getting grades lower than me, not just like I'm getting A and someone who's getting B. He's saying students who were getting grades lower than me, when the teachers would ask them, what do you want to become? And they say, oh, I want to become a doctor or a nurse or this or that. He says the teachers would encourage them, and the teachers would spend more time with them to help them get to where they want to go. But as a straight A student who's saying, I want to do what they're doing as well, even though I've got more capacity and more ability than they do to actually get to that goal, I'm being sidelined, I'm being put to the side simply because of my race. So the second lesson he learned from that moment is, whatever I do put myself to, right, whatever endeavors I take on, whatever challenges I take on, I'm going to be the best at it. And there's going to be no question and no doubt as to my #1 spot, right? And we see that from that moment on, whatever he gets himself into, he ends up being the best at it. Whether it's the good things or the bad things he gets himself into. But whatever way you look at it, he ends up becoming basically the top dog in whatever pursuit he goes into. Whatever career he goes into, he becomes the best at it. So he eventually moves in with his half-sister, Ella. This is a half-sister from his father's side. So his father was married previously to another woman, and so this is his half-sister. And so there's a large age gap between him and his sister. So he moves from Lansing to where his sister lives in Boston. And so when he moves to Boston, this is where we start to see Malcolm X as a person. He starts to become corrupted. So when he moves to Boston, he moves at around the age of 14 or so. But for his stature, for his height and how he looks physically, he looks like he's 21. Right? So he looks very mature for his age. He looks very grown. And so he starts to get access into places he normally won't be able to get into. Right? And he says that his first job in Boston was shoe shining. And he'd do shoe shining at a ballroom, right? So when people would come in during the night to dance and drink and do all of this stuff, he'd sit there and he'd shine people's shoes. And he says, when I started working at that ballroom, I started to meet all kinds of people. I started to meet drug dealers, I started to meet pimps, right? I started to meet all people from like the underworld, right? People more in the areas of crime as a career. And so he says that he starts to get more and more involved in this kind of world, right? He starts to make more and more connections with people. He starts to shake more and more people's hands. And over time we start to see his corruption becoming manifest, right? He actually reflects at one point about a particular girl that he was actually interested in. And so her name is Laura. And he says, it's interesting because he describes her as, she's someone who's innocent, she's someone who's quiet, right? She doesn't really get involved with other people, she doesn't get involved with that nightlife and everything, right? And, she's very strict with her schoolwork and all of this, right? Keeping in mind the guy's still a teenager, right? And he says, he actually, when he reflects on his life as a teenager, he says that meeting her was one of his biggest regrets. Because he says that I ended up changing her to become the worst person she can possibly be. She got into drugs, she was in and out of jail, all of these kinds of things started to happen to her. And he says it all started with me. Right? So look at his reflection, right? But also look at the fear he has of Allah, right? Because when he's recounting these stories, he's remembering these stories in like his 40s, right? This happened when he was 15, 16 years old. So he's thinking back as far back as he can in terms of his regrets, in terms of his mistakes, right? But when we do personal reflections, we forget about our sins from yesterday or the week before, you know, and we just kind of try and forget about it and move on in life. But he's able to recall these things that happened way in his past, and it still haunts him. Even decades later, it's things that are still on his mind, right? And this is a sign of sincere repentance, right? Even though you've distanced yourself from your sin, you hate the sin, it still eats away at you. That's the kind of person that Malcolm was. He didn't forget his mistakes. He genuinely felt pain about the things that he had done. And so he starts moving up in terms of the criminal world. He starts moving up in status. And eventually Boston is too small of a city for him. It's not big enough. So he moves over to Harlem. And when he gets to Harlem, that's when he reaches his pinnacle. That's when he reaches his highest point. Because now he becomes a drug dealer himself. Now he becomes a pimp himself. Right? Before it was more just making connections and everything in Boston. But now in Harlem, he's become all of these things. So this is when he's really at his worst, right? And eventually things start to get really bad for him. Things start to turn sour. Because now that he's built all of this power for himself, right? He's got control of a certain part of the city. He's got all of these connections. He sells guns on the side. He sells bootlegged alcohol as well. So like alcohol that, you know, they'll create on the side in like a basement, and then they'll pour it into like the branded liquor, right? Things that you buy in the store. So it looks like it's high quality alcohol, but it's actually something that they just made in the basement. You know, so he starts selling all of these things. He says there was a good few years where I couldn't count the number of hustles that I was in. And a hustle is kind of these little jobs that you do, right? Robbery, pimping, drug dealing, dealing with guns, right? The bootlegging of alcohol, like I mentioned, right? He's got his hand in all of these, you know, fahisha, right? Like all of this filth, all of this corruption. He's got a hand in everything that's going on in the city. Right? Like he's digging himself into Jahannam himself. Right? Like he's come to that point where he's completely become corrupted. And he gets into gambling as well, right? And when he gets into gambling, problems start to come up for him. So he gets accused by the Italian mob of stealing from them in a gambling game called Numbers, right? So now the Italian mob is starting to look for him. The police, the narcotics squad, are looking for him as well because of all the drug dealing that's going on. And it came to a point where they knew him so well that he had to stop selling drugs altogether, because he knew they know all of my spots, they know all of my corners, right? They know everywhere I sell, what times I sell. So he had to leave everything altogether when it came to the drug dealing. So the cops are after him. The Italian mob is after him. Because he's the top dog, he just starts making enemies wherever he goes. He speaks about a time where a young hustler, right, like another guy who does his similar hustles, he says, I got into an altercation with him, so I just beat him. I just punched him in the face a bunch of times. I didn't kill him, but I sent him a message. But later on, he learns that this guy is looking for him as well now, right? And then there's another guy named West Indian Archie who deals with gambling. And he says that Malcolm had basically stolen money from him as well. So now Archie is looking for him as well. So at his height, he was really the king of Harlem. But everything started to come crashing down right away. The cops are on his back. The Italian mob's after him. Archie's after him. This young hustler's after him. Things got so bad for him in Harlem that he had to actually leave. Because he was saying, I could tell that I'm about to die. Right? He's saying, as I walk down the streets, I can feel that people are looking for me. I can feel that people are looking at me. And someone's going to pull out a gun and shoot. So he leaves and he goes back to Boston. And when he gets to Boston, he ends up becoming addicted to his own drugs. So now he's a coke addict, right? He's taking cocaine. And he needs to start making money because cocaine is an expensive drug. So he thinks about, all right, let me start robbing people. That's the easiest place I can, that's the most simple thing I can do. There are people who knew from when he was in Boston before. He gets a bunch of people together and they start robbing. And you can see his intelligence in the way he robs people. So somehow he manages to have 2 white girls that he becomes friends with. And so these 2 white girls would go around the white neighborhoods and they'll knock on doors acting as if they're salesmen, right? So they're trying to sell something. And when they get to the door of a house, they start to compliment the house and everything, and the wife or the woman of the home, they end up giving them a tour of the house, and showing them every room and everything. And so they look around and they go in the house and they start doing a tour. And what they look for is anything valuable. Right? So as they're taking tours, going from room to room, they start looking for, all right, like where's the jewelry hidden, where's this, where's that. And if they find a house that's a good hit, they go back to Malcolm and 2 of his friends, Shorty and Rudy. The same night, they go over to the house and they rob it. And they rob it clean. So they do this for a while and he starts to reach that top again. Remember that promise he made himself? I'm going to be the best at whatever I do. He does it twice, right? He becomes a top dog in Harlem, and then when he goes to Boston, he does the same thing there. All of this happening while the cops are still after him, right? While all of these other guys in Harlem are still after him, and he's able to reach the top again. And it's interesting because the way he gets caught, it's a bit funny. So one of these places that he robbed, he actually stole an extremely expensive and an extremely valuable watch. Something that was so valuable that he ended up keeping for himself. He said, like, this is too nice of a watch. I don't want to sell it off to someone in the underworld. I want to keep it for myself. This is like a prized possession for me now, right? But he notices that there's a bit of damage on the watch. He notices that there's a diamond missing. So he goes to a jeweler and he hands it in and he wants a new diamond put in there. But what he doesn't know is that the owner of that watch obviously knows the value of the watch. But he also knows that the watch is damaged as well. So what does he do? He contacts all the jewelers in Boston and he tells them, look, keep an eye out for this watch, this model, this make, and keep an eye out for the damage, right? The damage being the missing diamond. He told them exactly where the missing diamond is. And so he goes in, he gives the watch, the owner of the jeweler, the jewelry store, obviously he heard the news, he sees that he's got that watch, so he calls the police. And then the police do a sting operation at the jeweler. So when Malcolm comes in, and it's a bit of a funny story to be honest with you, but he notes that the owner of the jewelry shop is Jewish. And he says, the owner of the jewelry store only gave the signal to the cops after he took my money. Right? So he takes the owner takes the money and then he gives the cops the signal that this is the guy. And so the cops come in, they grab him, he's arrested, he's gone. And the whole court proceeding was very interesting as well because he's a first-time offender. Even though he's a career criminal, he was never caught until now. And so maximum he should be getting is 2 years, right? but he made the biggest mistake of his life working with 2 white girls. Remember, this segregation is still going on at this time. And so the judge, the jury, even his own lawyer, everyone was cross with Malcolm because he corrupted these 2 innocent white girls. And so rather than having a 2-year sentence, he ended up getting a 10-year sentence. And he says, I got 2 years for robbing and 8 years for corrupting two white girls. Right? Because, again, it's all about segregation. Right? The only thing that the people of the time, the only thing that they saw in this whole situation is, these 2 poor white girls, this evil black man came and he corrupted them. They were innocent people before him, and it's only after they met him did they become corrupted. And so it's his fault. The second one, he had kind of started to cool down a bit. And when he moved to the second prison, the library was even bigger. Right? And remember when we said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is moving this guy around, right? Now, it's almost as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is educating him. Because now, out of nowhere, he's just fallen in love with books again. He's fallen in love with learning and education again. As he was when he was like 8, 9 years old, right? Now, a few decades later, he's fallen back into it. And in fact, he says, I loved reading so much in prison that when curfew would hit, right? So prisoners had to be asleep after a certain time. You couldn't stay up all night. And when curfew hit, they turned all the lights off except for the light in the hallway. And he'd say, I'd sit with my book, with the light in the hallway behind me so that I can read the book that I'm reading. And when I hear the guard walking down the hallway, I'll get in bed and act like I'm asleep. And then as soon as he's walked past, I'll get back out. And I'll read through most of the night like this, every night. Right? So he developed this obsession. Right? It's as if books became his drug now. Right? He's replaced cocaine with books. And he'll read about anything. He'll read language, linguistics, he'll read religion, philosophy, history. He read everything he can. And by the time he actually left prison, it's almost as if he was graduating with a university degree. Because now he's just carrying around all of this knowledge in his mind. And he's actually someone who had photographic memory. Which is why, that guy Archie, which is why Malcolm claims that he was making up his claims to try and get money off of him. Because he's saying, I have a photographic memory and I know that I put in that bet. But Archie's saying, I didn't put in the bet, but I remember I did because I've got photographic memory. So now he's leaving prison with all of this information on him, right? Now before he leaves, he finds out about something called the Nation of Islam. One of his brothers came to visit him named Reginald, and he became a member of this nation, right? Nation of Islam. I don't know, maybe the younger guys haven't really heard of this, but I'm sure the older guys have heard of it. So he hears about Nation of Islam, and his brother tells him, look, we don't eat pork, we don't drink, we don't gamble, we don't get into any of this kind of stuff. We work, we pray, we're disciplined, we're organized, we're this. And all of this sounds really beautiful for the new Malcolm, right? Because he knows what the old life is like. He knows what all of it is, because he was there. In fact, he was at the top, right? And so when he's hearing his brother saying, we're disciplined, we don't fall into our nafs, and we don't do this and we don't do that, he's hearing this and he's saying, yeah, all of this makes sense, that's perfect, right? But the reality is, the Nation of Islam isn't the same as Islam for us Muslims, right? This is a group who took the name of Islam and made it their identity. But they don't follow the tenets that we do as Muslims. They aren't considered Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? They're not considered to be a part of us. And that's because the way some of their beliefs actually run counter to our beliefs, right? One of the beliefs that a lot of them tend to have is this idea that the founder of their movement is a prophet, right? One of the beliefs that they have is that there's racial superiority, right? That black people are more superior to white people. But Islam, what do we say? In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He judges people by piety, right? By taqwa, by your God consciousness. How well you know Allah, how aware you are of Allah. So it has nothing to do with race. And so he hears about this movement and he falls in love with it, and he ends up becoming a part of them. And eventually when he gets out of prison, he comes out with all of this knowledge, all of this experience, and he goes and he speaks with the leader of the movement. His name is Elijah Muhammad. And when he goes in, he comes in with all of this energy, right? He's like, let's do something, let's get the ball rolling. And so Elijah Muhammad tells him, okay, I need you to start recruiting young people. Go out to the streets and start getting young African Americans to join the Nation of Islam. And so, again, his philosophy of whatever I commit myself to, I'm going to be the best at it. A movement that had about 400 or so people when Malcolm joined ended up with over 40,000 members by the time he left. Right? So he really brought life to this movement. He literally gave more than 10 times the size of the movement as it was before. So he starts preaching, he starts bringing in all of these people, he starts doing all of this stuff. And at first no one really took them very seriously. But one day one of their members gets beat up by cops, which is a very common thing to happen, right? White cops were beating up an African American man. And so the nation hears about it. And so Malcolm gets a bunch of the youth and they rush to the police station. And you can imagine there's like maybe a few hundred young guys standing outside the police station saying, we're not going to leave till we get our guy. Malcolm X walks in and he says, I want to see so-and-so. And they say, no, you guys have to leave, get out of here. And they say, look, we're not going to leave till we get him. So they end up letting him see the guy. He sees that he needs to go to the hospital. And so, again, they're saying, no, that's not going to happen. And Malcolm says, look, we're not leaving till you guys send him to the hospital. And so they back down and they send him off. And then the nation ends up suing the local government and they win $70,000. Now, all of a sudden, everyone starts to take the nation so much more seriously, because this is the first time that African Americans are seeing that, wow, the government's scared, the police are scared, right? And this is all happening because Malcolm X is working on pushing this movement forward. So then he ends up getting more and more people into the movement now, because now everyone actually sees the power and influence that these guys have. And it's not just a club, right? It's not just, they're doing this for fun, but it's something serious now. Now, problems start to occur when Elijah Muhammad starts to see how much influence Malcolm is starting to have, right? Because now it's as if everyone's following Malcolm. Everyone's doing what Malcolm wants, right? But Malcolm is still loyal to Elijah Muhammad. He's still going to him saying, all right, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to say? What's this, what's that, blah, 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 right? But Elijah Muhammad is seeing things very differently. And he's saying, all right, I need to find a way to get rid of this guy. And so during the height of Malcolm's fame and his popularity and his influence and power, he was one of the top, one of the most invited people for university lectures at the time. He was giving lectures at Harvard University. He was having debates in London, having Oxford Union debates. Right? Like he was at the top. And remember what we said about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guiding him, right? This guy didn't graduate high school. This guy has no degree from a university. This guy is literally self-taught from a prison library. That's his level of education, right? And even then, when we look at the prison library, Malcolm even admits, and he says, it's as if I was given the knowledge of the world, because the library in the prison, it had everything. It had books on philosophy, books on this, books on that. It was as if I had a university library in prison, right? Again, the qadr of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed that knowledge there for him. And so, like we said, Elijah starts to get jealous of him, and he starts to cause him issues. So now he tells him, you can't do any public lectures anymore, you can't go on the news, you can't go on TV, you can't write in newspapers, you can't do any of this stuff, you've got to be quiet. And so Malcolm's loyal. He says, yeah, okay, no problem. And around this time is the time when he changes his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. And the reason why he changed his name is because during that time, the last name of any black person in America was the last name of their slave owner. So the family that owned Malcolm's grandparents, owned his family line, his family heritage, their last name was Little. So he was known as Malcolm Little. He had the last name of his relatives, slave owners, right? The people who owned his family. And so as a protest, he came out and he said, why am I going to keep the name of the slave owners of my ancestors? I'm changing my name to Malcolm X. Why X? Because I don't know what my real people's last name is, because when we were taken from Africa, we lost whatever connection we had. So I'm just putting X there. Right? So that's how he got his name, Malcolm X. Now, what ends up happening is, do we know who JFK is? Right? John F. Kennedy. So he gets assassinated. Now, at the time that he got assassinated, Elijah Muhammad put out a rule across the nation of Islam. No one is allowed to talk about JFK's assassination. You can't. You're not allowed to. But for Malcolm, this doesn't make any sense. Because in his mind, remember, he's not Muslim just yet, right? He's still thinking in the way of Nation of Islam. So he's thinking, this makes no sense. This guy's the biggest devil of all, right? We should be saying something about this. Why should we be quiet? So he comes out and he makes a public announcement and he says, the chickens have come home to roost. And what that really means is, it's symbolic. What it means is, he had what was coming to him. Right? That's really what that meant. And so everyone kind of understood what he meant by it as well. And as soon as he makes that public statement, Elijah Muhammad has had enough with him. He calls for his assassination. And one of the people that was very close to Muhammad in the nation, one of his assistants actually, he comes up to him and he says, look, you know, I love you, you're an amazing person, I love you like a brother, all of this. But I need to let you know that Elijah Muhammad got in contact with me and he wants me to kill you. And so obviously Malcolm needs to think fast, so what does he do? He picks up his family and they get out of I think they were in Detroit or Harlem at that point. They get out and he goes to spend some time with Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. So he goes there and Muhammad Ali is getting ready to fight Sonny Liston, right? It's one of the biggest fights of his life. And Malcolm X is with his family, staying with Muhammad Ali as he's training and getting ready for the fight. And then after the fight, he ends up coming out as being a member of the Nation of Islam. He says, I'm a part of this nation now, I'm changing my name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, you know, I've left Christianity, blah, blah, blah. And now, Malcolm needs to be more careful as well because Muhammad Ali's become a member of the people who are trying to kill him. And so he openly comes out and he says, I've left the nation, not only because of the issues with JFK, but it turns out that Elijah Muhammad hasn't really been following the principles that he's been pushing. Because it turns out that he's had children with two of his secretaries. And Malcolm X is saying, I can't follow this person anymore. He doesn't stick to his own principles, right? Because zina, even in the Nation of Islam, zina was considered forbidden. You weren't allowed to do it. And now here you have your leader who's turns out he's been doing it. Right? So he leaves altogether. And when he leaves, he creates his own movement. Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he calls it. But before he starts working on anything, he says, alright, I've got to go to Hajj. There's something that's compelling me and pushing me to go there. And the interesting thing is, people from the Nation of Islam never really went Hajj. It was never really something important for them, right? Because again, they're not really a part of Islam, right? So for us, we consider Hajj fard, but for them, like, they never really saw any importance in it. But for whatever reason, again, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moving Malcolm in his life, pushing him into places. He ends up getting this immense need of, I've got to go to Hajj. Now the interesting thing is, he made a vow of poverty when he was in the nation, meaning, I'm not taking any money. Just as long as my kids are fed, I've got a roof over my head, that's it. But 24 hours, I'm going to do work, right? But now that he's out of the nation, he's got nothing. No house, none of that. The house he was living in was owned by the nation as well. And so he goes back to his sister Ella, and he asks her, can you pay for my trip to Hajj? And she was a part of the nation, but she left when Malcolm left. And so she says, yeah, okay. So she pays for it. And when he goes for Hajj, everything changes for him. This is the moment, after 30, 40 years of his life, this is the moment where everything makes sense now. Because when he goes there, he realizes whatever's happening in America isn't happening in the Muslim world. Right? In the Muslim world, when he went Hajj, there wasn't African toilets and European toilets and Asian toilets. There wasn't African bubblers and Asian bubblers and European bubblers, none of that. He says, I was eating from the same plate as people with the whitest of white skins, the blondest of blonde hair, and the bluest of blue eyes. People who, if they were in the United States, would have been considered white. And here I am, I'm sitting with them and I'm eating from the same plate as they are. And he says it's as if Islam has taken the disease of racism out of people's hearts and minds. Right? So now he's seeing things completely different. He sees that even the Nation of Islam had it wrong. Right? That actually, no, there's no superiority in terms of colour. That's nothing. Right? You look at people's dedication to Allah. That's what it's all about. That's real value. That's real goodness, he says. And so, he starts to really see things in a different way. He actually says, America needs to understand Islam because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. Right, so his time at Hajj transforms him completely. Right, and he meets a lot of important people on this travel as well, because he goes to Cairo before he goes Hajj, and after Hajj he goes places like Lebanon, Senegal, Ghana, right, Morocco. He goes to these countries and he meets with the leaders. And when he returns to the United States, because now really he's a new Muslim now, right? When he was in the nation, he wasn't really a Muslim. Now he's a new Muslim. So the leaders of Saudi Arabia, what they do at the time is they pay for a sheikh to go to the United States to be his teacher. And his name was Sheikh Ahmed Hassoun. And he was actually of, let me see, what was it? I think he was of Sudanese background. So, when he returns back to the United States, there's riots going on now, right? So, now things are getting violent in the United States. And everyone is pointing their fingers at Malcolm. Because just a few months ago, he was the one inciting all of this, right? Like, when you read some of his speeches, you see why he's so controversial, right? He has a lot of very famous sayings where it's, in an Islamic term, he's calling for jihad. That's what it is. And this is public. This is recorded. And it is being shown on TV, he's saying this. It's being shown on newspapers that he's saying it. Right? The FBI are following him. They tap his phone. All of this stuff was happening to him. Imagine someone saying all of this stuff today. Right? Out in public. Calling people to jihad like, oh, forget about it, you're done. Right? He was doing this at the time. And for example, some of the things that he'd say is, we're going to get our freedom by any means necessary. What does that mean, any means necessary? Right? He's implying violence. He's saying like, you're either going to let our people go, or we're going to cause some physical problems for you. We're going to make you hurt. We're going to make you bleed. And then in what's probably his most famous speech, the title, I'll just give you the title of the famous speech and you can read it on your own time. It's called The Ballot or the Bullet. Right? Ballot meaning voting, right? Having the right to vote. So he's basically telling them, you've got an option. You either give us the ballot, you give us the right to vote, or you receive a bullet. It's that simple. Right? This is the kind of things he was calling for before he went for Hajj. And so when he came back, all hell had broken loose. Everything that he had done before, it's facing him now. Because now there's violence on the streets, cops are being killed, or there's riots going on, white shops and everything, they're all being burnt down and attacked. Military need to be called into some cities. And so everyone's come to Malcolm and everyone's saying, it's all you. You done all of this. And so he comes, but now he's coming with the message of Islam. And he's saying, look, we got to work on all of this stuff together. We got to fix all of this together, but that doesn't mean that we only fix your side. You need to bring me and my people along with you. Right? We need to be equal in the eyes of God. That's his message now. Right? Now he's calling for Tawheed. Now, rather than promoting the nation of Islam on the news and the newspaper, now when people ask him a question, his immediate response is, Allah, Islam. That's it. Islam is the answer here. You want to solve the problems of this country? Islam. You want to deal with all of these racial issues? Islam. Now, whenever he's got an opportunity to speak, he's giving da'wah. That's all he's doing. Right? And keeping in mind, he only lives for a few months after this point. So, from the time that he left the movement, of the nation, to going to Hajj, now coming back, now he starts another organization. Now this organization is trying to work to unite the African Americans to deal with the racial problems. Right? And he's saying, whoever you are, whatever religion, just let's come and let's work for the betterment of our people, to help our people get out of the oppression that they're in. And so on February 14th, he is still living in the house that the Nation of Islam owns. And they've taken him to court. They took him to court in 1964. And so the court processes have been going on. He's trying to fight back to keep the house and everything. And so it's February 14th, 1965. Turns out a few people from the Nation of Islam come and burn that house down. In the sense of, look, we're probably not going to get the house, so you can't have it too. So they come and they burn the house down. The second time in his life, he loses everything. His house gets burnt down. And at this time, he had 4 daughters, and his wife was pregnant with a 5th. Right? So think about it. 14th of February, the city you're living in is after you. The cops hate you. The cops want to kill you. Half the city wants to kill you. People who you brought into the movement, mind you, the people who want to kill him, they're not strangers. They're people he shook hands with, he hugged, they shared food, they shared car rides, all of this. It's people he knows. Right? Imagine a city coming after you. And now the one place you felt safe, you don't even have that anymore. Your house is burnt down. So now the few friends he has left, he's staying at their houses and everything. And and subhanAllah, it's very interesting. Going back to that thing about intuition, right? Because we're coming closer to his final moments, to his death. Going back to that thing about intuition, he says, from a very young age, I knew that I was going to die a violent death. It's just something I knew about myself. From a young age, imagine that. A child who, deep inside himself, he's thinking to himself, I know I'm going to die a violent death. I'm not going to pass away in bed or anything like that. Something very violent, something bad is going to happen to me. Right? And he says, on February 18th, 4 days after his house is burnt down, he says, no one can get out without trouble, meaning get out of the nation. And this thing with me will be resolved by death and violence. So on February 18th, he's saying, my issue with the nation, it's going to sort itself out through death and violence. Right? Things aren't going to go easy for me. Now, subhanAllah, how interesting is this, right? He has just become a Muslim, a true Muslim. And he's not backing down. He's in a city that's hostile towards him, that wants to kill him. And the people you normally call for protection, the cops want to kill him as well. So who does he turn to? All he has is Rabbul Alameen. All he has is Allah at this point. Right? And he shows that faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because he continues his da'wah. Knowing that death is at his front door. Anyone, it's going to be anyone. He knows it. It's going to come at any time. He could leave the city. But if he leaves the city, he's abandoning his da'wah. He's abandoning his purpose. And so he stays. And on the 21st of February, he's giving a talk. Because now he's trying to recruit people into his new movement. And so he's speaking to a group of about 400 or so people. Maybe a bit more than 400. And while he's giving his talk, there's one guy in the crowd who yells out to the person sitting next to him, something along the lines of, stop trying to rob from me, stop trying to steal from me, get your hands out of my pocket, right? And so everyone's attention looks over to that side, and when everyone's attention is on that side, someone in one of the first few rows runs up to Malcolm while he's on stage, pulls out a shotgun and shoots him point blank, right in his stomach, right in his abdomen. And then he runs off. And while Malcolm's on the floor, another two men come and they start shooting him with pistols. All in all, he ends up dying with 21 bullets in his body. Right? Like, finish, that's it, you're done. Now, the interesting thing is, again, he knows he's about to die. He knows his days numbered. His days are numbered. And yet he walks up on that stage, he gives that talk, right, nonetheless. And it's very interesting because if you want, and I would recommend that you read his autobiography. He didn't actually write it. There was a man who actually followed him around for a few years. And Malcolm was just talking about his life to this man, and this man was writing everything down. And the last things that Malcolm said to this man a few weeks before he died, right? The last things Malcolm X said to this man, I'll read it out. It's the last paragraph in the book. He says, yes, I have cherished my demagogue role. A demagogue meaning, it's almost like someone who's looked down upon, someone who's rejected, someone who's hated, right? So he says, I've cherished it, right? I've cherished that image that people have of me, that hatred that people have of me. And he says, I know that societies often have killed the people who have helped to change those societies. And we see that with prophets, right? When there are many prophets who have come, and the people that they're trying to change end up being the ones who kill them, right? And he says, and if I can die having brought any light, having exposed any meaningful truth, that will help to destroy the racist cancer that is malignant in the body of America, then all of the credit is due to Allah. Only the mistakes have been mine. Right? This is true Tawheed. This is true Islam that he ended up dying on. After spending decades in corruption, after spending decades in filth, and then spending years, about 12 years in misguidance with the nation, thinking he's on the path, when in reality he's not. His last few months he spent on the right path finally. And it's a reward for him because when we look at his life, we learn a few lessons. The first lesson we learn is you follow the truth wherever it takes you. Right? Sometimes our ego gets in the way. We don't want to be corrected. He could have stayed in the nation.